Welcome to the Radically Genuine Podcast. I am Dr. Roger McFillin. The COVID-19 mRNA vaccination was pushed on the American people as a way out of the pandemic, a way for all of us to get back our lives and freedom, to save our grandparents from contracting the disease and reducing the spread and severity of the illness. It was touted as safe and effective. Despite mRNA technology being a novel gene therapy, approximately 81% of the American public got at least one dose as it was pushed as a vaccination. The Biden administration spent almost $1 billion and hired the PR firm, the Force Marsh Group, to create narratives that would decrease vaccine hesitancy. It was recommended to pregnant women, young mothers who were nursing, children, teens. Many places of employment mandate its use for you to keep your job. Kids in college required it to remain enrolled. Initially, the FDA asked for 75 years before they had to produce the Pfizer clinical trial data. We were told to blindly trust the government as the propaganda machine demonized those who questioned the safety and efficacy of this novel so-called vaccination. Why get a shot if I already had recovered from the disease? Reasonable people would ask. COVID continues to mutate and evolve. What's the value of being vaccinated now? Why would we take the risk for an adverse event when our children are young and healthy? They called these people anti-vax for openly questioning why Pfizer needed to hide their clinical trial data until the year 2096, because nothing screams trust the science quite like you can't see the data until everyone involved is dead. Community-based doctors would rarely question the CDC recommendations, and we heard over and over again that if it had FDA approval, they must be thoroughly evaluated, safe, effective. It became very contentious. Social media profiles would include shots and masks. People became part of a team, virtue signaling their commitment to the greater good. It divided our country. What were all these claims based off of? What does the data from the clinical trials demonstrate? Since even today, the CDC continues to recommend the COVID shot for 6-month-old babies. Well, a group of scientists and medical researchers represented by Aaron Siri sued the FDA under the Freedom of Information Act to force the release of hundreds of thousands of documents related to licensing of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccination. Today's guest is probably one of the most important people in the world right now that you don't know. I know there's a lot of COVID fatigue out there. Many people just want to get on with their lives. But what we're going to learn today is quite disorienting and threatening to many people's worldview. I can understand why you don't even want to think about it. But it's necessary we understand this. Today's episode is one of the most consequential episodes I've recorded because this information absolutely needs to be shared. I consider today's guest a hero. The 450,000 pages of clinical trial data needed to be organized and broken down and issued in reports. In order for it to be understood, it required scientists and experts from around the globe to understand this, to organize it, and be able to communicate it to the public. So what did it reveal? That is today's episode. I am very, very honored and proud to welcome Amy Kelly to the Radically Genuine podcast. She is Daily Clout's Chief Operations Officer, as well as the Program Director for the War Room Daily Clout Pfizer and Moderna Documents Analysis Project. She oversees the thousands of volunteers who are reviewing, analyzing, and reporting on the court-ordered FDA-released Pfizer and Moderna documents. She, along with Naomi Wolf, recently released a book which compiles this information named The Pfizer Papers, Pfizer's Crime Against Humanity. And from what I just found out, it is the second in a volume of reported papers. Ms. Kelly has over 20 years of experience as a project manager. Additionally, she is a certified Six Sigma Black Belt certified in change management methodology, and has experience as a business analyst, product manager, and strategist. Prior to working at Daily Clout, she worked primarily in the telecommunications, transportation, and medical device industries. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, graduating summa cum laude as a member of Phi Beta Kappa from a liberal arts college in the Southeast. She was uniquely skilled to be able to take on this huge project. Amy Kelly, I want to welcome you to the Radically Genuine podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, let's first start with your background. I'm curious to know how you got involved in the project in the first place before we really get into everything.
Sure. Well, as soon as the pandemic started happening and especially once the vaccine was being worked on and started to roll out, I was just very skeptical about what was going on. I've always been a researcher. I read a lot. And what I read in the data I saw, I have a background in data analytics as well, just was not making sense. The fear mongering around something with such a low case fatality rate. So there was that interest. And then I was also a fan of, and still am, of Steve Bannon's War Room and watched that a lot. And then I started seeing Dr. Wolf be on there. And I remember Dr. Wolf from back in the 90s when the beauty myth came out. And I was like, this is so interesting. They're from very different perspectives, yet here they are together. And I heard them put out the call. I think Steve really initiated it, that these documents were coming out and they needed people to volunteer and go through it. And at the time, I had the availability to do that. And so I signed up to volunteer. And the day after I submitted my volunteer application with my background information, which did not fit into the slots of doctor, nurse, medical researcher, all of that. But I put in the things you just read about me. They reached out to me and said, what would you think about overseeing this project? Because we really need someone to manage it. And I just wasn't expecting that at all. But I took a little bit of time to think about it and then said, yes, I definitely want to do this. I felt like this was almost providential and one of the most important opportunities I could have to really make a difference in the medical freedom fight. And so that's how I initially got involved.
So how many volunteers were initially part of this project? How many did you oversee?
Well, the applications to volunteer were pouring in. And so very quickly it added up into the thousands. And when I came on board, that's what I was starting to oversee. And, additional people joined after that. We had it divided up into 6 large groups. Those are the people who were mostly individually researching and going through and submitting their findings into a database we had set up. And then we had 6 smaller groups that are, I would say, a bit more specialized. And those are the ones that tend to write the reports. So if in the larger group, they find something that really needs to be highlighted, they could pass that along to me or to people in the smaller groups and say, I think we should dig into this more. And those are where the research topics have come from.
What type of experts were part of this group?
It is everything you can think of, all types of different doctors, medical researchers, medical investigators, lots of nurses, all different types of nurses, many data analysts, people from every walk of life. There's veterinarians that have gotten involved. I've just been very surprised and impressed by the diversity of people who wanted to give of their time and talents to make a difference with this.
Yeah, you mentioned something really important because I felt the same way with all the propaganda that was pushed on us for such a disease that, most people experienced, recovered from. Yes, people did die. Obviously, those who were of older age or had comorbidities or were not doing, well with their overall health were at greater risk. But the overwhelming majority of us, did, quite well. It was nothing more than a cold. So the fear mongering around this really set off alarm bells for many people. And I want to remind people what we were exposed to, and just play a short clip from President Biden, who certainly at least ran on part of a message about being able to, overcome this COVID pandemic and get our economy back on track.
Medical and scientific abuse. But if there's one message that needs to cut through all this, the vaccines are safe. I promise you, they are safe and effective. Listen to Dr. Fauci. Listen to the scientists who developed them through extensive and rigorous review. I did, and I took my shot publicly to demonstrate to the American people it's safe and effective. To address this challenge, we're going to launch a massive campaign to educate people about the vaccines, that they are safe and effective, and that they can go and get those shots and be good. I'm going to close with this. This past year has been one of the most painful years in American history. As I said, we've lost over 500,000 lives of the virus. 500,000 moms and dads, husbands and wives, sons and daughters staring at an empty chair, the dining room table, the kitchen table, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and over the country, all over the country, where the loved ones who are gone. They're gone. Empty feeling in your chest, like you're being sucked into a black hole in your chest. But all over the country, where loved ones once sat, there's an empty chair. And folks, look, there's so much we can do. As you see the broken hearts and the families that have been left behind, there's nothing partisan about this virus. It's too long we've allowed the virus to divide us. I met today with Governor Abbott, Senator Cornyn, conservative Republicans. I'm a Democratic president. We disagree on plenty of things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are plenty of things we can work on together. And one of them is represented right here today.
Okay, you heard it there. It was the U.S. president trusting the science, speaking to the experts. It's very, very clear this vaccine, it's a vaccine first, and it is safe and it is effective. And listen, if you wouldn't believe that, you're some conspiracy nut, right? Who doesn't trust science, right? There's this expert class that we must trust, and we're doing what is best for all of humanity. At this point, we have to suspend our critical analysis. All those questions that I posed earlier, suspend it, because this is what's best for humanity. And it's very clear that Joe Biden said that he got the vaccine. He knows the clinical trial data. He spoke to the scientists. He is confirming it to all of you. So let's start with the very basics, because I would say 99.9% of everyone globally really has no idea about the Pfizer clinical trials and what they were, how they're set up. But a lot of people repeat the messaging, right? You hear this all the time about the messaging. So what are the basics of the Pfizer clinical trial?
Yes, and I always think it's funny that it was science before the COVID pandemic, and then it became the science, So the basics of the trial are that Pfizer recruited approximately 44,000 people into this trial. They divided them essentially in half into a placebo cohort and the treatment cohort. They call it, I believe, the intervention cohort. And they had, I think it was 14 or 15 versions of their protocol. That's how many changes it had, which is an enormous number of changes for a clinical trial protocol during such a short period of time, which was more or less 1 year. And they gathered data from these people that were in the trial through November 14th. of 2020. That was the data cutoff date. And what the data cutoff date means is that that's when they took the data they had and cut it off at that point to put together to give to the FDA to seek emergency use authorization, EUA for short, which would give the authorization for it to be rolled out publicly. So that's the short version of what happened during their clinical trial.
Okay, so very basics. Initially, you were told that if you got the shot, you wouldn't be able to obtain COVID or spread COVID, right?
Right.
That didn't last long because so many people got COVID from after they got the vaccine. And so there was this message that people still repeat today, that it prevented deaths and reduced hospitalizations. Okay. So when we look at the basic trial data, when we look at those type of outcomes, how accurate was that?
That is inaccurate. And I'll even step back a little bit from that and say COVID was one of the top adverse events experienced by patients in the clinical trial. And so they knew very well that it did not prevent people from getting COVID. They knew from their own clinical trial data, yet that was never communicated to the public. Lots of people who got COVID during the clinical trial ended up being hospitalized as well. That could be from a combination of things, not necessarily just COVID. Perhaps they had comorbidities that led to that, but their case report file, CRF, case report file, I'm making sure I got the right term, indicated that, and we have that data from the clinical trial. What is interesting is that data cutoff date, if we go back to that, Pfizer knew about more deaths in the vaccinated group than they documented at that point in time. So they were supposed to report deaths in the clinical trial were supposed to be reported within, I think it was 24 hours. And so it would be in their data files for that. That did not always happen. It generally happened. But even once they got them, then there was a process that went through behind the scenes to get documented in their own data files and so forth. So they knew about at least 2 more deaths in the vaccinated group that they didn't include in the data at that cutoff date, even though they had it. What that means is that when they presented the data to the FDA, it showed that more people had died in the unvaccinated group than the vaccinated group, when in fact, at that point in time, the number of deaths were equal in each group. So there was no prevention of death benefit. And then in approximately a month after that data cutoff date and the additional data that came in, which would have been before it rolled out publicly in at least the US, there were a couple other deaths that happened among the vaccinated group. So it actually ended up that there were more in the vaccinated group who had died than in the unvaccinated group. So their own trial proved that what they were saying wasn't true.